Good evening. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Life, Princeton Hillel, and the Jewish Chaplain here at Princeton University. On behalf of tonight's event sponsors, the Center for Jewish Life, the Center for Human Values, the James Madison Program and the Department of Religion, and our numerous co-sponsors, the Office of Religious Life, the Episcopal Church at Princeton, Presbyterians, the Hindu Life Program, Chabad, the Muslim Life Program, Aquinas, and the Religious Life Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. The diversity of sponsors for tonight's lecture, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, is a testament to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks' prominence as a moral voice and religious leader for people of all faiths and backgrounds. Tonight's lecture was inspired by the personal experiences of a 1978 alumnus who is also a current Princeton parent and a longtime leading supporter of Jewish life at Princeton. This alumnus encountered anti-Semitism while here as a student and has made a deep commitment to addressing this important issue and other forms of hatred and bigotry today. On behalf of everyone here tonight, I want to extend my sincerest appreciation to him for inspiring this special visit to Princeton by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. We gather tonight on the 77th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. On November 9th through 10th, 1938, the streets of Germany were littered with shards of broken glass after the windows of Jewish-owned stores, buildings, and synagogues were smashed by Nazi stormtroopers and civilians. In those 2 terrifying days, 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. 1,000 synagogues were burned, and over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses were damaged or destroyed. Kristallnacht, as we know, is viewed by historians as the beginning of the final solution and the Holocaust, which resulted in the extermination of over 6 million Jews. It is on this anniversary of Kristallnacht that we gather to confront religious violence in our world today. We are very fortunate to have Professor Robert P. George with us tonight, serving as our moderator. Professor George holds the McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence in the Politics Department and is the founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He also serves as chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Professor George is a personal friend of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks and was a reader of the manuscript of Not in God's Name. Thank you, Professor George, for your critical role in organizing this visit. I now turn the evening over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Julie. And thanks to the Center for Jewish Life and the other co-sponsors and to our anonymous donor for the opportunity to be here and to introduce my beloved friend, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks served as Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth from 1991 to 2013. Since then, Lord Sacks has served as the Ingeborg and Ira Rennert Global Distinguished Professor of Judaic Thought at New York University and the Kressel and Efrat Family University Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University. He's also been appointed as Professor of Law, Ethics, and Bible at King's College, London. Lord Sacks was born in London and educated at St. Mary's Primary School and Christ's College, Finchley. He studied philosophy at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, where he earned his degree with first-class honors. He went on to study at New College, Oxford, which was new in 1379, and at King's College, London, where he earned his doctorate in 1981. That same year, Lord Sacks received his rabbinic ordination from Jews College and London's Etz Chaim Yeshiva. He married Elaine, who I'm delighted to welcome to Princeton, who is with us this evening, in 1970, and together they have 3 children, Joshua, Dina, and Gila. Lord Sacks has experience as a congregational rabbi and as principal of Jews College, the world's largest oldest rabbinical seminary. In 2005, he received a knighthood, and in 2009, had the honor of being made a peer of the realm. He sits in the House of Lords as Baron Sacks of Aldgate in the City of London. Rabbi Lord Sacks holds 16 honorary degrees, including a Doctorate of Divinity conferred in September 2001 by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, to mark his first decade as Chief Rabbi. He is the author of 25 books, as well as commentaries to the Daily Prayer Book, the Jewish Prayer Book, and the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach Festival prayer books. His 2001 book, the wonderful book, The Great Partnership, God, Science, and the Search for Meaning, has helped to shape the contemporary discussion of the relationship between science and religion. His new book, Not in God's Name, will, I predict, similarly guide discussion of the all too timely problem of religion and violence, the main topic of discussion this evening. Lord Sacks' life and work and the esteem in which he is held in Britain, here in the United States, and far beyond, including, I should add, at the Vatican, where we were together not long ago, confirms a view I have long held, namely, that the greatest teachers of mankind are not people who seek to free themselves from particular traditions in the hope of transcending all differences, but rather people who are deeply rooted in traditions and who draw insightfully on the resources of their particular traditions to bring illumination to universal human issues. Because he is indeed a teacher of mankind, I am especially honored to welcome on behalf of our entire Princeton community, Jonathan, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks.
Julie, Professor George, beloved friends, thank you for that wonderful hospitality which Elaine and I feel so privileged to enjoy. Thank you for the incredible help you, Professor George, gave me on writing this book. Robert George noticed all my mistakes. He saved me from considerable embarrassment. I just about got a pass mark, but it's a lot better for his insightful comments. And thank you for everything that Princeton represents. Princeton takes religion seriously. Not only the university, but the Witherspoon Institute, the Center for Theological Inquiry, and Princeton Theological Seminary. And maybe if I can just tell you a story about this. In 2010, I had the enormous privilege of being awarded by Princeton Theological Seminary one of the more unusual awards that I've received in my lifetime, the Abraham Kuyper Prize for my contributions to Dutch neo-Calvinist theology. Now, there are not a lot of rabbis who hold this award. So when it happened, I said to Elaine, I'm trying to work out what the Almighty actually means me to do with this award. How can it conceivably be useful to me? The truth is, it came in very useful indeed. Because in, I think, 2013 or 2012, the Dutch government banned halal and shchita, Muslim and Jewish slaughter of animals. And the Dutch Jewish community asked me to come over to defend both practices, halal and shchita. And I addressed parliamentarians from both houses. And I said, my locus standi is that as a rabbi, I received an award in Dutch neo-Calvinist theology. I then delivered the shortest speech of my life. Rabbis are not given to brevity, and as I point out sometimes, one of the discoveries Elaine and I have made these last few years, spending some time here, is that words that you think are common to English and American English mean something slightly different. And my favorite example is the word momentarily, which in American English means soon, but in English means briefly. So I would be introduced by somebody who would say, Rabbi Sacks will speak momentarily. To To which my reply was, rabbis never speak momentarily. But on that occasion, I did. And this was my speech. It must be the shortest on record in the Dutch Parliament. I said Holland was the place where European religious liberty was born. Don't let it be the place where European religious liberty died. And I sat down. And they pulled back.
God bless.
And these have been rehabilitated. So thank you for Princeton for allowing people to eat halal and kosher meat in Holland. Now, obviously, none of us can avoid a sense of emotion on this anniversary of Kristallnacht. But let me just say in relation to that in 2008, on the 70th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, whom I counted as a close personal friend, and I took the leaders of all the faith communities in Britain to Auschwitz, that for the 70th anniversary. And the impact that made on us as a group was extraordinary. And as we sat for a couple of hours after the visit in Krakow airport and poured out our fears, there was a bonding, an epiphany of meeting, of soul touching soul, as we shared our anxieties, the way that Europe is shaping at the moment. And I felt something very beautiful was born, a friendship that has borne real fruits in Britain. And the end result is that if we do remember where violence against people because of their religion can end, hopefully we can, by remembering history, avoid repeating it. So it is to that end that I dedicate my remarks this evening. I think I have a roving mic, is that right? So can I get some exercise? You just entertain yourselves while I get the exercise. But we are in an age when the most unexpected thing has actually happened. Because I don't think anyone expected religion to return to the international arena as a shaping force the way it is done in the 21st century. Certainly in Europe, people thought religion was in intensive care, it was dying, its life expectancy was limited. And suddenly it's returned. But it has returned not as a still small voice, but as the whirlwind and the fire and the earthquake. And it is shattering and devastating communities in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen, in a number of African countries, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, and so on. There is religiously motivated violence today among Muslims, among Christians, among Hindu nationalists, even in Myanmar on the part of Buddhists. And this is a serious issue that needs the most serious reflection. Now, the truth is, I wish I could summarize my book in 2 sentences, but I can't. Not in God's name is the result of 13 years of study into the roots of religiously motivated violence. And I can really only give you a little fragment of the argument. But let me do this. 2 of the most fascinating writers on the connection between religion and violence in the 20th century were Sigmund Freud and a Frenchman who taught in America called René Girard, who wrote a book many of you will have seen called Violence and the Sacred. And what is... This is... Okay, somebody wanted to hear Let There Be Light. Okay, it's done. What made them fascinating is that they inverted the normal relationship. Many people think that religion gives rise to violence. Freud and Girard argued that violence gives rise to religion. Very interesting. Girard's argument was that it is tensions within a society that lead people to take out their violence on a third party. And that becomes the primal religious expression, human sacrifice. The first religious act is human sacrifice, and the first sacrifice is the scapegoat. So, one way or another, that is Freud's theory. Freud's theory was the primal act of violence is of sons against the father, whom they murder and then feel guilt. And that guilt haunts them. He called it the return of the repressed. And the voice of the murdered father becomes the voice of God. That is Freud's theory. But what is really interesting is what is the primal source of violence. According to Freud, it was the tension between fathers and sons. But actually, if you look at mythology, you will see what are the main conflicts in myth. They are not between fathers and sons. They are between siblings. In Egyptian myth, Set and Osiris. In Roman, the founding story of Rome is a brother who kills a brother, Romulus and Remus. Hamlet begins with fratricide. Claudius kills his brother, Hamlet's father, to take his throne. And quite obviously, the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, is all about sibling rivalry. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and the two sisters, Leah and Rachel. Now, according to Girard, sibling rivalry is the main driver of violence in human life. Now, what is fascinating, and I didn't fully appreciate this, but it must be evident on reflection, is that the founding stories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam set those three faiths in a relationship of sibling rivalry with one another. Let me explain. Of course, in Judaism, we see ourselves as descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is who we are, and the people we aren't are Ishmael and Esau. Now, if you read the earliest Christian texts, anyone know what the first Christian texts were? The first Christian texts were the letters of Paul. And of course, Paul founded the Gentile church, as opposed to Jesus' brother James, that was known as the Jerusalem church, which was a mainly Jewish church. Whereas Paul went out and created the Gentile church, holding that you did not have, if you were a Gentile, to keep all the commands in Judaism, and you didn't need a circumcision either. Now, there was a community of Gentile Christians to whom he directed his letter to the Galatians, one of his earliest letters, around the year 40. And in it he says, you're making a mistake. You don't have to keep all the commands because we Christians are free of the law, whereas Jews are slaves to the law. And this is what he says to the Galatians. Abraham had children by two wives, one by the slave woman called Hagar, and the other by the free woman called Sarah. It is the Jews who are slaves to the law who are the children of Hagar, i.e. Ishmael, and we Christians who are born to the free woman Sarah, so we are Isaac. Do you see how that creates an entirely new form of sibling rivalry, not within the faith, but between the faiths? In his letter to the Romans, some 20 years later, he says this, Sometimes people can be born into the same family with the same parents, and one can be chosen and the other not. And the proof is Isaac and Rebekah has twins, one called Jacob, one called Esau. And what does it say when we're going to read it in the synagogue this coming week, when she worries about the pains that she is feeling in pregnancy, and an oracle tells her there are two nations in your womb, etc., and the older will serve the younger. Now, which is the older? Judaism or Christianity? Judaism. Christianity is the younger. Hence, Jews are Esau, and we Christians are Jacob. It is left to the 3rd century church father Cyprian to say it is we Christians who can see clearly. We are Rachel, whereas the Jews are Leah, who has blurred eyes. And you will see these figures over the door of many medieval European cathedrals, two women, one very beautiful one representing the church, and the other with a veil over her eyes representing the synagogue. Rachel versus Leah. It is left to the 4th century church fathers, Tertullian and John Chrysostom, to draw the ultimately difficult analogy, because they say the Jews killed one of their own, Jesus. So therefore they are Cain, and we are Abel. They have the mark of Cain. In other words, sibling rivalry is written into that basic story of who we are as Jews or Christians. Islam comes along and does something similar but slightly different, and says actually the tradition, the covenant passes through Abraham to Ishmael. And why does the Bible say that it passes through Isaac? Because the Jews falsified the Bible. In other words, the most basic story Jews, Christians, and Muslims tell themselves about who we are sets us in a relationship of sibling rivalry to one another. And if Girard is right, and if Freud is right, because Freud also took sibling rivalry terribly seriously, then there must be a tense and potentially violent relationship between these three faiths. Not that it often became violent, but it became violent often enough to mark the relationship between them as very difficult. Now, the interesting thing is that sibling rivalry appears in animals as well. Do you have a phrase in America like we have in England? The pecking order?
Yeah.
Do you have a pecking? You don't have pecking orders.
Yeah. Even in our egalitarianism, we have pecking.
Even in America. Oh, dearie me. So how does this phrase come about? Because the first of a brood of chicks that is born, the firstborn is a little bit bigger and stronger than number two. So it gets the first chance to eat, and if number two wants to eat, number one is strong enough to elbow number two out of the way. And clearly, since we are dealing with food here, this is a matter of life or death. If you just don't get enough food, you are going to die. You're not going to live through the rigors of winter. So it's clear that rivalry over a limited food supply creates the possibility of violent sibling rivalry in the animal kingdom. Harvard University Press published, I'm sorry to mention the opposition here.
Well, the pecking order is Princeton, Harvard.
Exactly. But a gentleman called Douglas Mock published a book on this a few years ago, using that wonderful line from Hamlet, a little more than kin and less than kind. And that is Shakespeare's definition of sibling rivalry, and it's a book on sibling rivalry in the animal kingdom, which can become violent as well. But you can begin to understand why there is sibling rivalry, because the siblings are in competition for something that's in scarce supply. Food. Now, what happens with human children, where, at least in Jewish families, food is not in scarce supply? So what are you competing for in a human family?
Parental attention.
For attention, exactly. If mum is looking after him, she's not looking at me, and that can create pretty serious havoc. Now, the second we understand that sibling rivalry is predicated on the logic of scarcity, we begin to see a way of looking at those biblical narratives that actually might be revolutionary. Because does it make sense to say that God's love operates by the principle of scarcity? Yes or no? It doesn't make any sense at all. The book begins with a statement, Genesis 1, verse 27, that God sets his image and likeness on every single human being. In which case, it doesn't make any kind of sense to say that the logic of scarcity applies to God's love. In which case, are those stories of sibling rivalry in the Bible really stories of sibling rivalry? What I do in the book is I go back and read them again. Not in any sense, in any esoteric way, but let me give you two examples, and you're probably familiar with them. The first is Genesis 21. It's the bit we read on the first day of the Jewish New Year. Isaac is born, Sarah is full of joy, and then as Isaac grows up, Sarah sees Ishmael mocking or something, and she says to Abraham, send that woman away. And you remember the scene. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away into the desert. Their water supply runs out. It's the midday sun. Ishmael is dehydrated. He's about to die. Hagar cannot bear to look at him die. And so she sits a distance away. She places him under a bush. And then, of course, the angel of God comes and saves. Now tell me, when you read that story, with whom are your sympathies? You cannot read that story without your sympathy being with Hagar and Ishmael. There's no way. So something very subtle is going on in this story, because this story is telling us that this particular covenant is going through Isaac, and yet our sympathies and our empathy are all with Ishmael. We are going to read an extraordinary chapter in the synagogue this coming week, the story of Jacob, Esau, and the blessing. You remember, Isaac is old, he's blind. He wants to give Esau a blessing. He says, prepare me some food. Rebekah overhears. She tells Jacob, I'll make the food and you take the blessing. Jacob is reluctant, but maybe he'll feel me, and I don't put on Esau's clothes. And Jacob takes the blessing in disguise. And then he leaves. And then Esau comes in. And the blind Isaac says, who are you? And Esau says, I'm your son Esau. And suddenly they both realize what has happened. And the Bible says, and Isaac trembled with a very great trembling. And Esau let out a loud and very bitter cry. Who are your sympathies with there? You have to sympathize with Esau, not with Jacob. The second we understand this, we understand the Bible is doing something very subtle indeed. It is telling us a set of stories that we read one way when we're young. And we say, yes, it's Isaac, it's Jacob. We are the descendants of Isaac and Jacob. We read it from only that point of view. But when we get a little more mature, we realize the Bible is telling us something else as well, which is we have to identify and empathize with
Ishmael and Esau, both of whom are blessed as well. Esau gives, God blesses Ishmael, and Esau produces kings long before Jacob does. And before he dies, Moses commands the Israelites, Lo tuta'ev edami ki achichahu, never hate the descendants of Esau because they are your brothers. We see, in other words, that the Bible, beginning with the story of Cain and Abel, tells us that the first recorded religious act leads to the first fratricide. Cain and Abel offer the offerings to God, a result of which Cain kills Abel. The Bible could not be more upfront. Yes, the primary driver is sibling rivalry, and yes, there's a connection between religion and violence. But don't believe that sibling rivalry is ever justified, because God's love is not a scarce commodity such that to love me, he has to hate you. To choose me, he has to reject you. God does not work that way. And the end result is that the Bible tells us a very sophisticated story indeed, which we can begin to see if you tell those 4 stories, but ignore everything except the last scene. What is the last scene in Cain and Abel? Abel is dead. What is the last scene with Isaac and Ishmael? They are standing side by side at Abraham's grave. What is the last scene with Jacob and Esau? They meet, they embrace, and they go their separate ways. What is the last scene with Joseph and his brothers? Forgiveness and reconciliation. Those 4 stories are telling us of a story that begins with fratricide but ends with forgiveness and reconciliation. And that 4th story of Joseph and his brothers is the prelude to the opening story of the book of Exodus, where 3 siblings, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, lead together. So the Bible is telling us that sibling rivalry is not inevitable. It is not written into the human script. And if you read the Bible deeply, not on the surface, you will see that the Bible is leading us beyond by telling us that God doesn't have to reject you to choose me. Now, I believe that in the 21st century, if we could just retell our foundational narratives that for centuries have set Jews, Christians, and Muslims in an antagonistic relationship with one another, perhaps we might begin to generate the kind of relationship that would allow us to live peaceably together, understanding that God, as a parent, loves all his children and loves them all because they're different and not because they're the same. Now, it may be wildly optimistic to believe that we could begin a retelling of who we are and thus put an end to centuries of antagonism. But the reason I do this is because 50 years ago, a very distinguished Jewish historian called Jules Isaac, who told the story I've just told you about those early church fathers, and discovering the Christian roots of Judeophobia, encountered a very great Christian leader, Pope John the 23rd. They met in 1960. And that encounter made Pope John the 23rd realize that we have to reconsider the way we tell the story. That led 5 years later, he was no longer alive, sadly, to the document known as Nostra Aetate, whose 50th anniversary we commemorated just a few days ago, that transformed the relations between Jews and Catholics so that 17 centuries of estrangement and hostility have been replaced now by a relationship in which Jews and Catholics come together as cherished and respected friends. And that, to my mind, is true heroism. The rabbi said, "Who is a hero? One who turns an enemy into a friend." And if it can be done between Jews and Catholics, it can be done between Jews and Christians and Muslims equally. And maybe the time has come for a new Nostra Aetate, to embrace all the faiths, to say, as I've tried to say to you, that God loves us for what we are and not for what we aren't. And if we can tell that story, maybe we can begin to bring to an end the centuries of hostility that have led people to kill in the name of the God of life, hate in the name of the God of love, and practice cruelty in the name of the God of compassion. At any rate, let us give it a try, and let us hope that we can live together in mutual respect as one family under the parenthood of God. Thank you very much indeed.
So beautiful, Jonathan. Thank you. Well, thank you, Lord Sacks. Now, as you entered, you should have been given a green card, and if you'd like to compose a question, you're not required to, but if you'd like to compose a question, just write it out on the green slip of paper, and then in a little while, when it comes time for Q&A, someone at the end of each aisle will, Rabbi Ariel will collect the green papers. But Lord Sacks, just to begin, I was so touched and moved by your invocation of the great document Nostra Aetate, whose 50th anniversary we're now celebrating. It was promulgated at the Second Vatican Council, the great opening of the Catholic Church in the modern world. What is striking to me about that document, looking back now on it, is that what it attempted to do, I think quite successfully, speaking as a Catholic myself, quite successfully, is dig into the tradition itself, the tradition of the church itself, for the resources for a new and richer and more beautiful understanding of the church's relationship with the mother faith, with the faith from which she emerged. And I was thinking about that in connection with the work, as Julie mentioned, I'm doing together with my former student Daniel Mark on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was thinking about that in relation to an event that happened at Christmas time in Egypt 2 years ago, when Coptic Christian churches, which had been violated and attacked by mobs at Christmas time over several years, were actually protected by ordinary Egyptian Muslims who created rings around the churches to ensure that no negative, hostile forces would attack the churches. Now, these Muslim Egyptians were not operating out of some alien tradition, but digging into their own tradition. If you ask them, people did ask them, why are you doing this? Why are you protecting the Coptic Christian churches? They spoke from the perspective as Muslims, from the teaching of Islam, on the importance of protection of the innocent, of protecting people who were vulnerable. Once again, they reached within their own traditions. My own sense is that it's a mistake to try to lead people from the wrong path by telling them to repudiate everything about their tradition and accept something new. That it's much better, ordinarily, to invite them to look into their tradition for the resources from which a Nostra Aetate comes, or that wonderful, beautiful scene of Egyptian Muslims protecting the churches comes. Does that make sense?
It makes terribly good sense to me. We are three peoples of the book. We have very rich scriptural traditions. And the question is which we focus on and which control our understanding of the other. And it does seem to me that this claim made by beloved friends of mine like Richard Dawkins, whom may the Almighty preserve for many years in good health. I call him His Majesty's loyal opposition. This idea that we will somehow solve the problems of the world by secularizing is the most crazy idea imaginable. I mean, first of all, we've tried that. No. Europe, in its great age of reason in the 18th century, tried, as it were, to secularize its thinking about everything, and indeed universalize everything. Kantian philosophy, reason, let's get rid of our particularities. And what happened to Europe was exactly what Freud called the return of the repressed. Because in the 19th century, there was a return to particular identities. And 3 substitutes for religion were discovered. Number 1, the nation state. Number 2, the race. And number 3, the economic and political ideology in the form of Marxist communism. These were 3 substitutes for religion as a basis of particular identities. And the nation state led to 2 world wars. Race led to the Holocaust. Economic ideology led to Stalin and the Gulag, and the death of at least 100 million innocent human beings. So the idea that we should abandon religion in order to create peace is what I call the John Lennon theory of the universe.
Imagine,
Imagine nothing to live, and, in the end, he too fell as the subject of violence. So, it was a very attractive idea. But the truth is that we have those resources within our sacred texts. And we know this because, for instance, Islam gave rise in Al-Andalus, in Spain, between the 10th and 12th centuries to that phenomenon of convivencia, in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in greater tolerance, not in 21st century terms, but in greater tolerance than at any other time or any other place in the Middle Ages. So the great faiths have that resource within themselves, and the example you gave of the church, Coptic churches in Egypt is a great example. Nostra Aetate is. And that's really why I wrote Not in God's Name. I could have written a secular book on religion and violence. I deliberately wrote a religious book because I think if religion is the problem, it is the solution, or at least a very important part of the solution.
Yeah. I suppose you could sum up some aspects of the work of René Girard, who died just this past week, as you may know.
Oh, yes. No, I didn't
Yes,
know
he
that.
just died in the past few days. He was at Stanford, of course, here in the United States. And a part of his work could be summed up by saying, well, if you think religion is bad, try secularism.
Yeah.
The death toll is even much higher. But I wonder if an additional part of the solution to the problem of religious violence is deepening our understanding and thereby our appreciation of each other's faiths. In many cases, I find, even with our very well-educated and brilliant, gifted students, people from a strong background in one tradition will have what turns out really to be a caricature view of other faiths. And I think if we understood each other's faiths more fully, if we had a richer understanding, we would have a greater appreciation.
I think that's true. I also think there are other ways of doing it, which in some ways are even easier. The 2 best ways of reaching interfaith understanding are food and music. Because somehow or other, for almost everyone who's religious. Food has a kind of semi-sacramental quality to it. And I remember many years ago doing a theological dialogue between Jewish rabbinical students and African bishops. And we did 3 days of interfaith dialogue. And I said at the end of about 2 days of it, this is really cognitive, which is the English word for boring. And so I said to them, why don't we do something to end the conference? Why don't we sit round a big table at night and we will teach you our songs and you will teach us your songs. And then we're going to tell you our stories, and you're going to tell us your stories. And these trainee rabbis and these African bishops, we sat together from 10 in the evening till 3 in the morning, and then we danced around together, and I have to say that whether it was going to be his first or second coming, the Messiah missed a wonderful opportunity. So I think there are bonds of friendship that can surmount the worst kinds of theological misunderstandings. And the most important thing that can happen is for us to recognize that somebody of another faith is human the way we are. Different laws, different customs, different traditions, but there is a level at which soul touches soul, and we suddenly realize that we are humans together, and that can then lead to that deeper appreciation.
Would you regard it as chauvinistic or nationalistic of me to claim that we seem to be doing a pretty good job in the United States, here in the United States, by comparison with, say, Europe, of promoting interfaith harmony and relations? For example, Christians in the United States, I believe it's fair to say, have not only a good attitude toward Jews, all things considered, but have good relationships with the Jewish community. And I look over across the water and I see the situation going in the opposite direction, the situation deteriorating. Maybe not between Christians and Jews, between secular Europe and Jews.
I think Europe is losing the plot religiously. Europe is a phenomenon, really a Christian phenomenon. And when it loses its Christianity, it loses its sense of who we are. And when we lose a sense of who we are, we get very much more fragile and prickly and easy to offend. I think America has always had a clear sense of what is our story. There is an American story that every group that comes here, and this is a society built out of refugees, really successive waves of people fleeing religious persecution. It was a land built on the search for religious freedom. So from the very outset, it had that sort of story, which was really, actually, oddly enough, the story of the book of Exodus. The only difference between the American story and the Exodus story is instead of the Red Sea, you had the Atlantic. Instead of the Egyptians, you had the English. And instead of Pharaoh, you had George III. So one way or another, America has this very powerful story that everyone internalizes. And because it was a refuge for people fleeing from persecution, there is that kind of, what do you call it, that kind of Freemasonry, whereby we recognize that,
each other, yeah.
Jews recognize Catholics, who recognize Germans fleeing persecution, who recognize the original Puritans fearing persecution. So I think America has done this incredible job that no other country can really rival. Whereas in Europe, we are a little short of identity. And the other thing that is happening in Europe is the new communications technologies that are having a huge impact. What is happening today in the world through Facebook and YouTube is that a conflict anywhere can become a conflict everywhere. And that is what's really scary about Europe right now, because people are importing tensions from the Middle East to Europe instead of exporting coexistence from Europe to the Middle East. And that's really what's happening.
What is your own sense of the future of European Jewry, including the British Jewish community?
Well, yeah, I think it's uncomfortable. I did warn Angela Merkel and others 8 years ago, in 2007, that the Jews of Europe were beginning to ask, is there a future for Jews in Europe? And it's troubling. But as far as I'm concerned, we stay and fight. Because, as I say very often, the hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. And if it's not safe to be a Jew in the streets of Europe, then it's not safe to be a European on the streets of Europe. And this is what we have to understand. Why were Jews hated? Because they were different. There were non-Christians in a Christian Europe. There were non-Muslims in a Muslim Middle East. They were different. But the truth is we are all different. And difference is what makes us human. Because we're all different. Even genetically identical twins are different in 50% of their characteristics. Because we are all different, none of us can be substituted for by anyone else. It is difference that makes each life, as Judaism and Islam both say, like a universe. You cannot substitute one for another. So a society that has no room for difference has no room for humanity. So we will stay and fight anti-Semitism, because in the end, it's not just about Jews, it's about every one of us.
And do you think that what you say is true not only of British Jewry, but also of French Jewry, of Belgium, of Holland, or will it be different across the English Channel? Should they stay and fight?
Jews are leaving Scandinavia. They are leaving Holland. They're leaving Belgium, and they're leaving France. This has been happening very quietly for a long time. It was the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket that brought this into public visibility. But we have a number of congregations in London that are congregations of French Jews. We have that many people fleeing from France. And I don't think this is égalité, liberté, or fraternité whatsoever. So I think I would beg, and I have pleaded with the leaders of Europe to realize that if within living memory of the Holocaust, Europe became Judenrein, free of Jews, this would be a stain on the conscience of Europe that no time would ever erase. And I think it is time for European leaders to get real and serious about anti-Semitism and every other form of religious and ethnic hatred.
On the anti-Semitism front, my own perception is that in Europe there are really three quite distinct sources. One is nationalist, neo-fascist, skinhead, neo-Nazi type elements. Two is extreme secularists who may not have any particular hatred for Jews as individual people, but who, for their own ideological reasons, would do things that would make it impossible for devout Jews to remain, banning male infant circumcision, banning kosher as well as halal slaughter. And then the third being anti-Jewish sentiment brought by some immigrant populations or elements within immigrant populations. Now, these three sources not only have nothing in common, they would have a lot of animosity toward each other. But there seems to be a common factor in antipathy either to Jews or to necessary Jewish practices.
True. But I just keep telling people to not put up with it. So what we do in Britain is we have our own security service, which is run in close conjunction with the police and the government. We have an incredibly professional team monitoring all potential issues of anti-Semitism. And we have 4,000 mainly young people who stand as security volunteers on every Jewish event. Now, it is very, very interesting because we have suddenly discovered that this is one of our best outreach organizations. Let me explain why. Not every Jew, may I be honest, really enjoys being inside synagogue.
I'm shocked.
So being a security volunteer allows you to be outside synagogue and still doing something beautiful for the Jewish people. What is more, if you have a young man and young woman doing security duty, during the longeurs they get to know one another, and it became our best matchmaking service as well. So I have to thank the anti-Semites for bringing all these Jews into the fold and arranging all these Jewish weddings.
Very good. Well, I'm going to move now to the questions from the audience. And the first one that appears on my pile here, actually, is one that I hear from my students all the time. So I'll give you a crack at it. I'll preface it by noting that I believe it was Prince Charles who, in paying tribute to Lord Sacks, said that he is a light unto our nation, recalling, of course, the great statement, I think, of Isaiah, if I have it correct, which gives insight into the notion of the election of the Jewish people, the chosenness of the Jewish people. Why are the Jewish people chosen? Well, is it because they're especially good-looking or especially intelligent or whatever? No, that they're chosen to be a light unto the Gentiles, unto the nations, not just for their own sake, but to be a light to others. But my questioner says, how are Muslims and Christians expected to react positively to the notion that even though we are all God's children, the Jews are the biblical chosen nation? This may make people of other religions feel or seem inferior. So it's a question about the understanding of election.
There is not a single nation in history, or almost not a single nation in history, that has not seen itself as chosen.
Lincoln.
The almost chosen
Lincoln.
people.
Yeah. Referred to the United States, to the Americans, as this almost chosen people.
Melville in White Jacket calls, ours is the guardian of the Ark of Liberties of mankind. John Milton says that when God is about to do something new, he does it first, as is his manner to the Englishman. And it was a 19th century politician who said, being born English is winning the first prize in the lottery of life. Anthony Smith, the sociologist, has written a book called Chosen Peoples and documents this for everyone. So what is really important is taking that phrase and translating it into a world that is both global and diverse. And I did this in the form of a phrase, and it became the title of another book of mine. The phrase is the dignity of difference. God, having made a covenant with all humankind through Noah in chapter 9 of Genesis, in chapter 12 says to Abraham, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house, and be different. to teach all of humanity the dignity of difference. Judaism is a protest against the world's first empires, which appeared in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. And the attempt to impose a single truth on all humankind is the imperial instinct throughout the ages. Today I call fundamentalism the attempt to impose a single truth on a plural world. So Judaism is the eternal protest against one way, one truth, one culture, one dominant power. And says no. God created diversity, not uniformity. Not one life form, but 300,000. Not one language, but 6,000. God is the creator of human diversity as of biodiversity. God loves difference. And that is how I tried to universalize particularity. Before publishing the book, I road tested this idea for 2 years on groups of non-Jewish students. And I was fascinated to see how the Sikhs and the Hindus and others would leave that seminar walking an inch taller. And you could read the think bubble above their head. And it went, we always knew we were different, but we thought that was a bad thing. And here's the Chief Rabbi telling us it's a good thing. And the University of London students at their union building in Gower Street in the middle of London have a plaque. It's just by the front door with a sentence from Dignity of Difference which reads, "Because we are all different, we each have something unique to contribute." And that is what the non-Jewish students took from that phrase. There was a little library. There's a little library called the Library of Living Jewish Philosophers. And the volume that's dedicated to my thought is called Universalizing Particularity, which is what I've done. And that is how we can each believe that we are special in God's sight, each of us, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, without negating the other.
From an internal point of view, though, looking at the Jewish faith from the inside, is there a reason for Jewish chosenness? Is there a mission of the Jewish people?
Well, of course, you know this, because
but tell them.
I once, Jews argue. I once had a public conversation with the great Israeli secularist Amos Oz, whose opening sentence was, "I don't think I'm going to agree with Rabbi Sacks on everything, but then on most things, I don't agree with myself." So I came to the conclusion that God chose the Jewish people because he loves a good argument. So, but I really and truly believe that each of us has something unique to contribute. Let me give you an example. For a real spiritual moment. You know that Sikhs are a kind of monotheistic breakaway from Hinduism. And Hinduism is a faith of surpassing beauty, but it is not a monotheism. And the end result is that India was, and still is to some degree, a class-based, a caste society. Now, in Judaism, we hold that hospitality is greater even than receiving the divine presence. You know, hospitality is the most beautiful thing. But I never saw hospitality the way Sikhs do it in India. They call it langar. And they give food to the hungry in a most massive way. But what is spiritually beautiful about this is that the highest ranking Sikhs regard it as their greatest honor to serve these street beggars who are starving. And I thought to myself, wow, I never saw anything as beautiful as that, and I had to go to Amritsar, the Jerusalem of the Sikhs, to see it. You know, Robert, that that Judaism never produced the beauty of Beethoven's string quartets. Mind you, that very modest effort to translate Shakespeare into Yiddish carried with it the famous opening page, Shakespeare verteidigt und verbessert, translated and improved. So, I mean, you've got to be crazy not to believe that every culture has something unique to contribute, whether it's French Impressionists, or it's Russian novels, or it's German symphonies, or the formal, serene beauty of a Japanese garden. So we are all chosen for something.
Here is another question that, again, I hear quite often from my students. How do you respond to other rabbis who use Jewish texts and tradition to condone violence? They cite plenty of sources, just as you do. Are they wrong, and are you correct?
Well, of course. I mean,
Yeah,
that
last
is
part
that
was
to
easy.
ask a rabbi.
What do we do with those texts in the Bible, for example, that seem to not only condone, but sometimes command violence?
There was a Jew called Baruch Goldstein who killed 29 Muslims at prayer in the cave of Machpelah in Abraham's cave, because he thought these are the Amalekites of our time. A religious Jew who read the Bible, which tells us to kill the Amalekites.
Wipe out the Amalekites.
Not knowing that Maimonides rules that we can no longer identify who are the Amalekites, and rules that only genetic descendants of the Amalekites come under the category of Amalekites. So you can't say these are enemies of Israel, hence they fall under that general rubric. In other words, this is a religious Jew who simply had not read the texts. And this is what scares me right now. You have people who think they know because they've read one text, but none of the commentaries on that text, or none of the authoritative readings of those texts. And it is ignorance right now that is allowing fundamentalism to prevail as a cause of violence, which means that we have to stand up and protest, as I had to do at the time, and as any other responsible rabbi would do likewise. Not merely say this is wrong, but show them in 12th century sources why this is wrong. This is not a matter of open interpretation. You have your view, I have mine. Maimonides' ruling on this is authoritative and unequivocal.
You've shared with me, and it would be good to share with the audience, your thoughts about the development within the Bible of attitudes toward violence, moving from the earliest texts to the later ones when it comes to the question of violence.
The Hebrew Bible is the first literature in history that finds God in history. As you know, there was a Catholic historian, what was his name? The Gifts of the Jews, what was his name?
Paul Johnson.
But, no. Paul, what's his name? The Gifts of the Jews by, I've forgotten the name. Thomas? Cahill. So his argument is that Jews invented time, linear time. This, of course, is a case that's been made by a whole number of historians, Arnold Momigliano, the late Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who wrote a book called Zachor, Jewish History, Jewish Memory, the anthropologist Mircea Eliade, who wrote a book called Cosmos and History. Jews created this sense of time as a journey with a starting point and a destination, or time as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It wasn't cosmological time, which all ancient civilizations had. So God works through history. So, for example, in Genesis 2, you have a statement of monogamy. One man, one woman, and the statement, therefore a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. A statement of monogamy. Now, monogamy did not become authoritative in Jewish life until the 10th century, something called the institution of Rabbeinu Gershom. So it takes time for that to evolve. The rejection of slavery is implicit, pretty much explicit, in the story of the Exodus. But how long did it take, even here in America, for slavery to be abolished, and not without a civil war? The Bible clearly sees violence as an outrage. Exodus 6, Genesis chapter 6, the generation of the flood, says, Vatimale haaretz chamas. The world was filled with violence. And the most searing sentence in the whole Bible, one of the most searing in the whole of religious literature, and God regretted that he had created man on earth, and he was grieved to his very core. And yet look how long it has taken us to minimize violence. So the Bible unfolds over time. So in an age of genocides, the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy says, if you don't kill your enemies, they're going to wipe you out. That is what it's talking about. But within 5 centuries of Moses, you have Isaiah chapter 2 with its famous statement, nation will not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The earliest statement in all of civilization of peace as an ideal. It was not to recur for many centuries later, and so on and so on and so on. The rabbis rule in the 1st century that none of the wars against the 7 nations are applicable anymore because we don't know who's a Canaanite and who's a Perizzite. So that is how you are to understand the Hebrew Bible. It is a story that states its ideals pretty much up front at the beginning of the story, but realizes the road to them is long, and it never gives up hope that we will get there.
The next question is about the... I'm sorry? The last question is about the relationship between nationalism and religion. And the thrust, I'm going to revise the question slightly. The thrust of the question is nationalism and religion a dangerous mix? Is that a recipe for violence? And then the questioner says, for example, are Zionism and Pan-Arabism dangerous because they mix religion with nationalism?
The mix of religion and power is always incendiary. And it becomes terribly, terribly important to create that, what in America is called the separation of church and state, First Amendment. And you know, I'm sure you know, the roots of this lie right at the beginning of Judaism and Christianity. In Judaism, they lie in the fact that a king cannot be a high priest, and a high priest can't be a king.
That's right, yeah.
Secular and religious authority are different. In Christianity, they lie in the statement of Jesus, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Yeah, the coin.
And it is Montesquieu in the 18th century who fully understands that the Bible's tripartite leadership, king, prophet, priest, is the prototype of the separation of powers, which he then writes in L'Esprit des Lois, which then informs the American debate on the separation of powers. So that separation of powers is absolutely fundamental. And so Zionism really was, in its origins, a secular phenomenon. The first Zionist thinkers were Moses Hess, Roman Jerusalem, 1862, Leo Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation, 1882, and Theodor Herzl, Jewish State, 1896. So the secular project of Jews re-establishing their national life in the land of their beginnings was a secular project. And Israel is actually a secular state with a secular Knesset, and its religious life is oddly enough predicated on the system of the Ottoman Empire, because you have these three autonomous Muslim, Christian, and rabbinical courts, each of which
governs those communities.
Governs marriages and issues of personal status and so on. Never confuse religion and power, because it is the most fundamental error of all, that you can believe that you can impose truth by force. And peace comes to the world when people realize that truth requires freedom to flourish, and power should be left secular, respecting people's religion and their religious freedom, but never confuse religion and power. They are two separate things that must always be kept apart.
The prophetic tradition in Judaism, which of course Christians fully accept, says at the same time that in the name of religion, in the name of God, power must be held to account. There's got to be something higher in the name of which political power can be subordinated to the ideals of justice. So Martin Luther King here in the United States, in his great fight against the evils of racial injustice, condemns the system of segregation, which was the human law of the time, in the name of the higher law. In his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, he says, the natural law, or the law of God, a law that's higher than the merely human power. So it looks to me like there are two errors that need to be avoided. One is the confusion of religion with power, and the other is permitting power to escape religious criticism.
Yeah, the prophet speaks truth to power, but actually it was Kierkegaard who said one of the nicest things. He said, when a king dies, his power ends. When a prophet dies, his influence begins. And I think that's about right. The other thing is this, that power and influence sound very similar, but they actually operate by different logic. Supposing you have total power, a consummation devoutly to be wished, like the synagogue president who used to say over every vote, all those in favor say aye, all those against say, I resign. Now, if for some reason you decide to share that power with 9 others, how much power do you have left? 1/10 of what you began with. Supposing you have a certain amount of influence, and you decide to share that influence with 9 others, how much influence do you have left? 10 times as much as you began with. And it's very, very interesting that there are 2 challenges to Moses' leadership. Moses briefly combined the 2 roles. He was the political military leader of the Jewish people, and he was the prophet, but they were very different roles. And his leadership was challenged on 2 fronts, both in the book of Numbers. His power was challenged by Korach. His influence was challenged by 2 prophets called Eldad and Medad. It's very interesting that Moses cannot tolerate a challenge to his power. And he prays to God that the ground should open up, and it does, which every politician wishes would happen to his or her opponents. But when it comes to influence, Joshua sees Eldad and Medad prophesying, and he runs to Moses and says, Moses, shut them up. And Moses replies in these words, are you jealous on my behalf? Would that all God's people were prophets. And that is where you see the difference between power and influence. Power is an arena of conflict, because the more I share, the less I have. So I will always want more, and you will want more, and we will conflict. Influence, because it's not a zero-sum game, is a non-conflictual arena. And that is why when religion stays with influence, it can be a source of great generosity and leave the conflict to the politicians, because they know how to deal with it, and we as religious leaders surely don't. Thank you very much.
Lord Sacks, Jonathan, thank you.
I want to thank Professor George for moderating this evening so brilliantly. To Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, thank you for honoring us with the breadth and the depth of your wisdom, and for inviting us to transcend our religious rivalries and to see with you a vision of a world that is abundant with God's love. I want to thank Lady Sacks for gracing us with your presence. I want to thank the staff members of the Center for Jewish Life and Rabbi Sacks' assistants for all their dedication to working out the details of this evening. And I want to thank our donor for inspiring and challenging us this evening. Everyone here is invited to a reception and a book signing, which is down the hallway. And I just want to explain this detail. There'll be 2 lines. If you have a book from your home library that you brought with you that you want to get signed, you get to go to the fast line. And if you're purchasing a book this evening, you go to the other line, and everybody will be given a Post-it note, and it'll be your opportunity to write down the dedication that you want Rabbi Sacks to write when it's your turn in line. I hope you enjoyed this evening as much as I did. Thank you again, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks.
That was good. Thank you so much.